at. Our next speaker is Brent Stoffer, differential use of unimodal signals in a multimodal courtship of wolf spiders, Schizocosa ocreata. Go for it.
All right. Actually, yes, I am not muted. Wanted to make sure. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to be talking about the differential weight of unimodal signals within an overarching multimodal signal in the brush-legged wolf spider, Schizocosa ocreata. And today, I'm going to basically be telling a story of lots of different projects that have gone within the UTS lab. So I want to emphasize before I get going, not only do I want to thank my co-authors here, of course, but also an array of different researchers who have worked in the UTS lab over the years. And certainly my main research interest is in multimodal communication. And in multimodal communication, we do often compare unimodal versus the full-blown multimodal signal and how individuals respond to that, and also compare how they respond to each of the unimodal signals within that overarching multimodal signal as well. I would go so far as to say, though, that in general, though, we often don't always think of, or sometimes at least for me, I know, it's difficult to remember that we need to also think about how each of the sexes actually weigh that unimodal signal differentially. So even if there is a stereotypical sex that tends to be the courtier and a stereotypical sex that tends to be the one interpreting that courtship signal, I do think it's important that we consider what each of the sexes perceive those unimodal signals within that overarching signal. And so that brings me to this overarching question. And again, I'm going to be kind of telling a story of a variety of different projects over the years that ultimately address these types of questions. And I'm going to be doing this within the star of the show, the brush-legged wolf spider, Schizocosa ocreata. Great for a variety of different reasons. First off, we do have some very well-established female preferences within this species. These are just a couple of them. There's some other certain traits that they prefer. But within the visual modality, what I really want to emphasize is they do prefer males with larger tufts. So in this picture in the bottom left, these males have tufts on the forelegs and different bristles of their within the tufts, and females do prefer males with larger tufts. But when they court, they're not only waving their legs around and doing different leg arches, et cetera, but they're also courting using percussive and stridulatory components within their vibratory signals, as well as a full-blown multimodal display. And females do, within the vibratory modality, prefer males with higher percussive amplitude. So we have well-established preferences within each of the two signal modalities in which they court. However, not only do we have these strong baseline preferences, but we also have a lot of evidence across a variety of different contexts that there's remarkable plasticity for this species, perhaps more than we ever imagined for an invertebrate species once upon a time, right? And not only that, but perhaps one of the most powerful tools, in my opinion, that we can use in this species is this combination of multimodal playback, where we can convey visual signals via video playback with an iPod. And we can also convey vibratory signals through the use of these tiny disc benders that we can put in front of the iPod, and we can separately manipulate visual signals in one modality and the vibratory signals in the other modality. So a very powerful tool to eventually address this kind of overarching question again. Well, since there are multimodal signals within this species, how does each sex use the individual modality within this overarching multimodal signal? Now, before I dig into some of the more specific questions I'm going to address, I do want to address that they are using these signals inherently different. So we are doing a little bit of apples and oranges sort of comparison here, because on the male end of things, they are actually kind of looking at these multimodal courtship signal as potential competitors, right? They might try to out-court that potential male, for example. Whereas on the female end of things, they are assessing potential mates. So it's certainly different context. But we can address questions at the basic level, like do they even respond to unimodal signals when the full-blown multimodal signal is not present? Also, do they respond to variation in that signal? Can they learn within using unimodal signals alone? Do they respond to differences based on kind of the number of choices or the number of perceived competitors perhaps as well? So let's dig into some of these more specific questions, starting off with the basic one. Do they even respond to these unimodal signals? And we have overwhelming evidence throughout the different years in the UTS lab that the females do in fact respond, even if you do only a unimodal visual signal or a unimodal vibratory signal. This is true using live males. This is true using playback. This is true whether you use completely naive females or if you use females that have been have learned and to be exposed to some of these signals during their penultimate stage. On the male end of things, they also can respond to these unimodal signals, and they will court in response to the courtship of another male if they have been kind of basically properly trained to do so. And they do that again, regardless of whether it's vibratory signals or visual signals. So in terms of this basic question, clearly across the board, both sexes can respond appropriately, even if only one modality is present within the multimodal signal. But will they respond to variation within each signal modality? Will they respond if we manipulate the tough size? Will they respond if we manipulate the perceived amplitude of the vibratory signal? And on the female end of things, it's again an overwhelming yes. This is one particular study where we dug into some really nuanced questions with respect to this. So whether it's a no choice setting or a two choice setting, or whether it's within a multimodal signal, increasing the tough size or increasing the amplitude, or if it's across a nice little preference function, clearly females do respond to variation to increase tough size or to variation in increasing amplitude when presented as a unimodal signal, or again, even presented as a multimodal signal. On the male end of things, this is a question that Bree Robbins within our lab addressed. And so I'd encourage you to check out poster session 1. I believe there are recordings of that. So I encourage you to check out the nuanced details of that. The short answer is yes, they do appear to to respond to different male tough sizes. On the vibratory end of things, this is the one kind of little nuance of like, we don't seem to have any evidence thus far, but before we kind of put the nail in that coffin, there's perhaps some follow-up studies to be done. So across the sexes, we do see some evidence that females clearly respond to variation, but males, there's a story to be told still there. And then also on the visual tough size end of the spectrum, though, I encourage you to check out that poster. In my opinion, one of the most interesting questions to ask is, well, can they actually learn with using a unimodal signal alone? And do they learn differently depending on which modality they experience that kind of training regime? And in females, they can, in fact, learn using unimodal signals alone. So a lot of my dissertation focused on exposing females during their penultimate stage to particular kind of qualities of males and seeing if they prefer those later on as adults. So if you give them small tufted males or large tufted males in the visual modality as penultimate females, they prefer those as adults. If you give them low amplitude or high amplitude signals as penultimates, they prefer those amplitudes as adults. So each modality they appear to be able to learn within. On the male end of things, I've mentioned that males will court in response to the courtship of other males. The more thorough explanation as to why this takes place is we have evidence that if they have been trained to associate the male courtship signal with the presence of a nearby female, they will then, when they are later subsequently only exposed to male courtship, court as if there's a female nearby, presumably because they are trying to steal that female that they have learned must be nearby because that other male has already courted. And when we train them, we can train them on unimodal vibratory signals or unimodal visual signals, and they will just learn just as readily. So across the board, both males and females do appear to be able to learn within each modality in the within vibratory or visual signals. So the next question arises is, well, okay, do they respond to kind of variation in the number of choices presented to them? And by this, I'm not trying to address whether they can count or anything like that, but just do they make different decisions based on the number of options presented to them or the number of perceived competitors? And on the female end of things, this study is rather complicated, so I'm going to try to kind of gloss over some of this, admittedly. But in general, when you give them a choice of two males, we can kind of see clearly that they prefer kind of a target male, because that target male is of higher quality than the competitor male. However, all of a sudden you throw in a third option, even though that third option, the decoy, is of lower quality than the target or the competitor, that third option actually shifts the female's preferences. And we can kind of trick that female into shifting her preferences, regardless of whether we do that in the vibratory modality or the visual modality. So we have some evidence here that whether, if you give them two choices versus three choices, that they will vary in their
10
responses.
minutes.
On the male end of things, perhaps more kind of interesting with the respect to the number aspect of it, if you give them more males that they perceive as potential competitors, they increase and ramp up their courtship. So perhaps some evidence for social facilitation. So across both males and females, we have at least some evidence. Again, we're kind of comparing apples and oranges to some extent, especially in this context, but that they do respond to variation in the number of choices given them in either sensory modality. Now, thus far, pretty much everything I've emphasized so far is just like yes or no. They either do it or they don't. I've focused intentionally mostly what's happening qualitatively, like do we see these types of behavior responses? Perhaps more importantly, like I mentioned at the very beginning, we need to look at also what happens kind of quantitatively when we give them these unimodal signals. And on the female end of things, we have past evidence, certainly, and for a variety of studies, they do actually equally prefer the unimodal signals in terms of the actual sheer number of receptivity displays. By all means, they heavily prefer that multimodal signal, but as unimodal signals, they weigh them relatively equally. However, on the male end of things, we've demonstrated in a variety of different contexts, including a recent publication that just came out about a few weeks ago, that the males will actually court to a higher extent if there is a vibratory modality present, and to a lesser extent if it's only a visual courtship signal that is presented to them. So, in summary, on the female end of things, even though they seem to weigh the modalities evenly, on the male end of things, they seem to prefer the vibratory signals, or rather respond more to the vibratory signals compared to the visual signals. Now, I don't necessarily have a clear, definitive answer as to why, but some of my thoughts thus far are that visual signals might be more derived for females, and perhaps because within Schizocosa, the Habits Lab, for example, has done a series of studies that have showed, like in general across the genus, vibratory signals seem to be more dominant within the Schizocosa species. So it's not necessarily that maybe males have enhanced vibratory sensory systems, but maybe rather females, because it's more derived and because they're the choosier sex, perhaps they're just kind of responding just as well to the visual modality. Perhaps to a greater or to a different extent, these signals just have different roles in ways that we don't quite fully understand, and we need to dig into to a deeper extent. Maybe one tells them a little bit more about directionality, like where is that male located, for example. But hopefully, regardless of whether we have a nice kind of definitive answer or not, I've at least convinced you that certainly sexual dimorphism extends beyond what just meets the eye. I think as human beings, right, it's very easy for us to just look at spiders, say, yes, they are sexually dimorphic, or no, these two are actually kind of similar. But in reality, we need to certainly think about the whole multimodal system, the whole variety of sensory systems that these spiders might be able to use. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions and like to thank everyone involved over the years on these various projects. And here's a little sneak peek at what happens when we put our Schizocosa ocreata in a Zoom session. So I'm happy to address any questions if there's time to do so. Thanks.
Great. Eileen asks, have you guys ever looked at visual capacity between female and male Schizocosa ocreata?
Yeah, so Eileen, I don't know if you're getting at this question, but really what probably needs to be done a little bit more of to some extent, and to be honest, I forget if it's done to the same extent in the males, but kind of basically we need to have some sort of more level playing field, right? again, I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of doing apples and oranges here with the respect to responding to male courtship signals. But perhaps something like having a predator prey response, are they responding to different modalities differently, would be a better thing. So on the visual capacity, certainly, we've done those studies where we cover different pairs of eyes of the females and respond to them. It'd be really interesting to do a full blown project with that on the male end of things as well. Of course, we haven't really done any of the playback stuff in a predator prey context. So that's something that would be missing there, is to try to find a level playing field where both modalities are still utilized kind of to the same extent, I think would be, or to at least similar extents would be the trick there.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll move